Welcome to Voices from My Bunker 2020. This episode is titled, The Last Ferry Has Left the Island. What the hell? In other words, I'm interviewing myself because that's how I feel lately, that I'm basically talking to myself. With the exception of some of the interviews that I've done for this podcast with people who don't live around me, I feel like there's an estrangement going on, not in the virtual world, but just the opposite. An estrangement going on within friends, family, neighbors, with respect to dealing with this coronavirus. Not all, but the exceptions I can count on one hand. So that's what I'm going to get into today. I have spent some time trying to come up with the right image and trying to rearrange my email newsletter so that it looks more exciting and less dreary and you don't have to click so much, because I found out from experience that people who receive my emails, they don't like to click. They want everything right there on the page. And I can't do that. So anyway, my new email announcements of these podcasts and maybe any blog posts as well is just going to have one click. Just one. And I'm going to point it out with big letters. Click here. All right. So let's get into it. The last ferry has left the island. What the hell? I coined a term about 10 years ago when I first lost weight and was beginning to maintain the weight loss, and realized that I really had a evil twin living alongside the perfectly nice person that I am, that I have two sides, and particularly with respect to things that I want. And I used to call it the reality ballpark, that I needed to take a seat in the reality ballpark in order to deal with my day-to-day issues. Whether they be eating issues, whether they be money issues, whether they be, can I paint this room and have it look better at the end of my effort, as opposed to hiring someone to paint this room. I simply had to sit myself down in the reality ballpark and take a look at what my strengths were, what my weaknesses were, and develop a plan. So I had many references to the reality ballpark with respect to weight management. And the reality ballpark for me with the weight management was simply the scale. As soon as I avoided the scale, I knew that it was the reality that I was avoiding. So one of the things I did was to just weigh myself daily and take that avoidance mechanism, which was second nature and almost a default position, out of the equation. And since I've maintained the weight loss for 10 plus years, I think it was a pretty wise choice. But I thought about the reality ballpark in the past month, having nothing to do with food management, but having to do with risk management and how pretty much March 17th seems to be the day in 2020 when most of us in the US at least got on board about the danger of this coronavirus, and the shutdowns began, the quarantines began, and the reality of it for the first month, I think, was shared. We were pretty much looking at our four walls, and whether we were alone like I am or with our partner and families, it added a whole new definition of being at home with the family or being at home with yourself. When a trip to the grocery store becomes the most high-risk thing you can do, life has changed. So for the first month, particularly with people who were over 60 and had underlying medical conditions, it was pretty much universal that as we looked at the information coming toward us, it appeared that life wasn't even going to begin to have more choices until there was a vaccine. Yes, we could get ourselves to the grocery store because we had to. Because if you tried to use an Instacart or a Peapod or an online service, at least in the Northeast, you could make an order April 12th, and the delivery date was April 24th. Sometimes 3 weeks. At some point, there was a 4-week window. So clearly, one had to get to the store somehow, either on one's own or have someone do it for you. And if you didn't have someone to do it for you, then you did it yourself. So that was the case with me. But many folks that I talked to said that not only was the grocery store going to be their only visit, they were going to call their hairdressers and get the color combination or whatever that is, and she'd see the hairdresser in a year. She did not see it as possible. Others said there simply weren't going to be overnight visitors. There weren't going to be any weekends where they would leave in the summer to go visit friends that they visited year after year. That anybody visiting would have to be on the outside and would have to be the 6 feet apart, and it couldn't be for that long. And all of the March, April sanctions, which were predicated pretty much on the virus being transmitted via surfaces. If you remember, the surfaces really figured prominently in April and March and April. They didn't start talking about the ability of the virus to really transmit just in aerosols, not a sneeze, not a cough, but just breathing in, breathing out next to somebody until the June and July era. So for me, that ramped up the threat, because as the surfaces thing began to be more manageable and also potentially less lethal, in other words, I didn't have to wipe down all my groceries when I brought them in June, but I did in April. So, but the expansion of the transmission of this virus to simple breathing really jolted me. And I realized that a serviceman, for example, who had to come in the house to fix a boiler or I don't have a boiler. What do I have? A gas heater or an air conditioning or a new appliance, that they obviously were going to have to be masked. But what was new now was that I was going to have to be masked for 3 hours after they left, because that was the guidance. That if you were sharing inside space with someone, everyone should be masked, number one, unless they were in your bubble. And I'll discuss the bubble thing in a minute. But an appliance person coming in would be masked. And once they had done what they had to do, you would have to be masked for 3 hours, because it was potentially those aerosol droplets, if the mask had fallen a bit or had been readjusted or whatever, as is the case with many masks, the aerosols would still be in the air. So that is how I adjusted to that. And I had thought, based on the conversations that I'd had in March, in April, that people around me in the similar high-risk category were still dealing with the same degree of red alert. And it just has become very obvious to me that that's not the case. That weekend visits now happen. Hairdressers appointments are being made. Big box stores are being gone to. Overnight visitors. And I went through a stage where I was like the COVID police in my family and friend circle. I was worried about them and the risks they were taking. I knew their situation. I knew how old they were. I knew what their medical situation was. I was worried about them. They're taking risks they don't have to take. It's not like they have to go out to work like so many people and have to deal with risk management because they simply have to in order to put food on the table and pay rent. These were people that did not have to do these things, and yet they were doing them. So after I realized that, wow, the COVID policeman role takes more out of me than I think is worth it in terms of what the result is. Because what I've noticed, and it's really not very surprising, who wants to call someone who's going to get yelled at? And they're going to yell at you. Nobody. I sure don't. So the bottom line is that these folks really aren't calling me as frequently as they used to. And here's the other thing. I'm not calling them either. We've sort of agreed we're not going to go there. It's without animus. It's without some, one singular thing. It's just a drifting away. And I would not have predicted this in any shape or manner, because it felt to me like there was simply a reality ballpark that we were all sitting in March and April. And the information that I kept abreast of in May and June did not lead me to think that this danger had abated at all for our age and those who have pre-existing situations. But in fact, it had expanded the risk. But what I've recognized is that the last ferry has left my island, filled with many of my friends, my family, my neighbors. And I'm left on the island going, what the hell? How is it changed for them and not for me? And that brings me to the bubble concept. I'm sure you've all heard of it. They talk about it in scientific ways as if there's a bubble within a family that's living with one another. And that's a bubble. And it's on the surface, you're safe to be with those members of the bubble. So you don't have to mask, you don't have to maintain the 6-foot social distancing. But along with the whole bubble concept, it was equally discussed how that bubble truly can be broken very easily if members of the household are going out to work and are being exposed on a daily basis, or a member of the bubble decides to just go into a store and maybe doesn't have a mask, or some member decides to go and see a friend, all of that means that the bubble is no longer a safe bubble. And yet, when I talk to people who are smart and who know the same information I do, if not more, they've decided that their family is their bubble, regardless of where they live, regardless of what members of that family have interacted with other people. That means their boyfriends, their girlfriends. It is unbelievable to me that these people who are hyper vigilant about certain aspects of risk management coexist with a totally porous bubble. It is like a dike that is leaking, not just in one segment of the dike, but all along it. But that risk is blotted out. These folks don't perceive it that way. And as long as it's their family, they somehow feel that's their bubble. And they have from day one. Most of my family did not follow Charlie Baker's, who is the governor of Massachusetts, who has a 90-plus-year-old dad who lives fairly close to him, I think, in north of Boston. He did not see his father for 100 days, starting in March. 100 days. Members of my family never went a weekend without seeing extended members of their family, regardless of age. They were just assumed to be the bubble. Well, we're like family. Didn't matter where they lived, didn't matter who they lived with. If their last name was the same, or they were a boyfriend or girlfriend of that last name, they became part of the bubble. And I begin to realize that, wow, it's not an information gap. They've got the same information I have. They've just decided that in order to live their life, they have to define bubble in a totally different way. And apparently, it does not translate into fear for them. I'm fearful for them. They are not. So I'm absolutely faced with, what is the point of me bringing it up? And there is no point. But it leads to an estrangement where I'm not picking up the phone or texting or doing the things that I normally would have done as often as I used to. So that it's not a question of the virtual nature of relationships distancing. It is the fact that even with the modes of communication that we had in March and April that kept us connected, the telephone, the texts, the emails, I'm not doing 90% of what I used to do with that, nor are they. And that's why I feel like they're gotten on the last ferry off the island and they're waving goodbye, but feeling a little sorry for me that I don't get it, that life goes on. And I'm looking at them going, what the hell? What the hell? So I'm sitting in what I think is the reality ballpark. I've got my seat. And literally, there's not even cutouts of humans in this reality ballpark. So all of you who are complaining about the cutouts in the baseball games and sports games, try a stadium that has all empty seats except there you are going, what the hell? So that's how I feel at this point in time, August 26, 2020. And it worries me because I think I don't see anything on the horizon making me think that this vaccine is going to be possible for someone like myself for a very long time. The most optimistic views are 2021, maybe early 2021. But I'm telling you, when the FDA does a flip-flop like they did in the past week about these plasma treatments, and the FDA does the flip-flop from their own guidance because of pressure from the White House, I'm not lining up to get that first vaccine. The seed of doubt, the seed of estrangement that I'm talking about just within my family is just expanded out into the whole government institutional, who do you believe, who do you trust? And I Googled Dr. Fauci because I hadn't seen any pronouncements from him. And then it was said that he had to be quiet for a while, not because the White House was leaning on him, but they had a polyp removed from his larynx. I guess the poor guy has been talking so much, he's wrecked his vocal cords. So, you know, when Dr. Fauci can't talk, we are in trouble, because I don't know who else I believe on this subject. All I can tell you is I know who I don't believe. And not only don't believe, feel that there is, if you follow their guidance, you might end up dead faster than if they never opened their mouth. So, wow, talk about estrangement. So I'm left to my own devices, trying to make educated decisions. It's not like I'm living exactly my March, April life. I have people come into the house to do work, to help me with things. They're always masked. I'm always masked. I wear my mask for 3 hours after they leave. That happens. I've tried the socializing outside on the porch. My first efforts really suggested to me that despite a lot of organization of food and where the chairs were and all of this stuff, that my instinct is to go and ladle the chowder. My instinct is to go and help someone get the chocolate sauce. So my whole instinct to do this properly needs to be educated. And it's exhausting. At 75, it's exhausting to try to put on something that's socially appropriate. So winter's coming, so the outside events wouldn't even be possible, even if I got better at it. So I'm just looking at a period of time where certainly estrangement from the government, which has been for 3 years now, and now is at an operatic level. Absolutely. To say that it's Shakespearean, I think credits this personality with more respect than he deserves. And all I'm saying is that those who carry his water, those who champion his causes, I suspect you've made some bad decisions in your life, as we all have, but none more consequential than this one. I'm going to end with a couple of quotes this week that really resonated with me. One of them was from the writer Octavia Butler, whose books I have never read, but they are on my list now after reading this. And she apparently wrote a novel years ago, a visionary type of novel that was set years ahead. And the years ahead was 2020, okay? And this was in her book, written many, many years ago. To be led by a coward is to be controlled by all that the coward fears. To be led by a fool is to be led by the opportunists who control the fool. Wow. How do you economically describe these past 3 years better than that? I don't think you do. The coward who has fears and the opportunists who control the fool. That's what I've seen for 3 years. And then we have, really, I think this woman is a flat-out genius, and I have only read some of her nonfiction, believe it or not, because I'm not really one that has enjoyed surreal sorts of science fiction writing. But Ursula K. Le Guin, I believe. That may not be how you pronounce it. But I remember seeing her, I think there was an American Masters or an American Experience or some documentary where she was featured. And I was slack-jawed at how prescient she was, how poetic, how absolutely opinionated, but not in a bitter way, although she had much reason for bitterness because she was a female science fiction writer. And, you know, boy, talk about gaming being a male venue. Science fiction, for a time, they just did not recognize female writers, but she was brilliant in this documentary. And so I began taking notice of her. And here's what she says about anger. And I have to watch out for this for myself because it certainly fuels the current political situation on both sides of this continuum. But I think it is very important to recognize the usefulness of our emotions. So here's Ursula on anger. Anger continued on past its usefulness, becomes unjust, then dangerous. It fuels not positive activism, but regression, obsession, vengeance, self-righteousness. Corrosive, it feeds off itself, destroying its host in the process. Okay, deep breath. Deep breath. I think we're all bearing witness to the destruction of its host in the process. And what I have to be careful of, what we all have to be careful of, is that whatever usefulness anger may have for us, it has a shelf life of utility. The constancy of it, the depth of it, the absolute fuel pot that it gives us can become unjust and dangerous. So let me leave you on that, along with the concept that in place of my family relationships and friend relationships and neighbor relationships, I have ordered the 4 volumes, and they're all book doorstop size books, each of the 4 of Samuel Beckett's letters. So hopefully that will allow me some room to ruminate without destroying myself in the process, and perhaps will give me a way through the next few months, because I can only go a few months at a time in terms of my planner. Really, my planner doesn't go beyond September 15th right at the moment. I don't know about you. So I hope you are in a seat at the reality ballpark yourself, for your safety, for your risk management, for your mental health, because reality at this point, we can ignore it. I used to ignore, in terms of weight, I used to really ignore that. I had the ability to absolutely ignore. So I know it's possible to ignore the obvious. So I'm just suggesting don't ignore the obvious. And I'll see you next week. Maybe I'll start writing letters after listening or reading Samuel Beckett's. Take care of yourselves.